So let's talk about a time period that we call the Road to Revolution, or the Revolution itself. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. And although this is technically a course overview video, I do plan to break down these topics individually as well. So if you want to see videos specifically on the French and Indian War, the Boston Tea Party, etc., leave me a comment below. If there's enough interest, I'll definitely make some. Okay, so this is part 2 of our colonial history series. If you haven't already, go check out part 1, which covers the period from 1607 to 1763. In the meantime, here's a quick review of what we've covered so far. Between 1607 and 1763, the 13 British colonies grew significantly in size and population. We talked about the beginnings of slavery, the growth of cities, the development of colonial life, and the increasing tensions. With Native Americans culminating in the French and Indian War, that last topic is really important for this period, because the French and Indian War kicked off this whole revolution thing. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, first of all, what does this phrase road to revolution even mean? Well, it simply means that this was a period of growing tension and conflict between Britain and its North American colonies, ultimately leading to the full-blown American Revolution. Okay, so what happened during this period? Here are the key events to know. The end of the French and Indian War. 2. The Proclamation of 1763. 3. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. 4. The Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. VI. The Intolerable Acts. And 7. The First Continental Congress, Lexington and Concord. Okay, so no. 1. As we talked about in our last video. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 with a British victory. But this victory came at a cost. The war had been expensive, and Britain needed to recoup some of that money. So where were they going to get it? From their colonies, of course. In fact, the French and Indian War showed British leaders that the colonies could actually contribute significant resources to the empire in times of need. And so they started to think of the colonies less as distant settlements and more as possessions with economic potential. So that brings us to No. 2. Remember how I said that Britain gained lots of land during the French and Indian War? Well, this land was mainly west of the Appalachian Mountains, and much of it was claimed by various Native American tribes. Initially, the British didn't have any interest in this land, and so they didn't do anything about it. But then the war ended, and British leaders realized that maybe they could get a return on their investment. They issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. British leaders thought this would prevent future conflicts with Native Americans, but it did just the opposite. Many colonists who had fought in the war had dreams of owning land in the West, and now their dreams were crushed. Even worse, existing settlers in the Ohio Valley and areas like western Pennsylvania found themselves on the wrong side of the law. As far as they were concerned, they had fought for the right to settle wherever they wanted. And this proclamation made them feel like Britain was going back on its word. And that feeling of betrayal is really important for this period. Britain had always presented itself as a champion of liberty, defender of property rights. But now it seemed to be taking away land that was rightfully owned by colonists. So number 2, the Proclamation of 1763, a good old-fashioned land dispute. Okay, no. 3 and 4, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. With the economy weakened by the French and Indian War, Britain needed to raise money. The Sugar Act of 1764 placed taxes on sugar, molasses, and other goods imported into the colonies. The revenue raised from the tax was supposed to help pay off war debts. The Sugar Act was significant because it was the first time Britain directly taxed colonial consumers. Before then, most of Britain's efforts to raise money involved regulating trade through the use of tariffs and other restrictions. But this act shifted the focus to actual taxation, and not just any taxation without representation. Remember, the colonists had no voice in Parliament, and they argued they shouldn't be taxed by a body in which they had no voice. The outcry over the Sugar Act led Britain to repeal it, but this was only temporary. A year later, Britain passed the Stamp Act, which required colonists to purchase special stamps for all kinds of printed materials. Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. Unlike the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act was a direct tax on goods produced within the colonies. It was also enforced through the use of stamps, which were literally pasted onto documents. This was yet another way in which the Stamp Act inflamed colonial opposition. This image of the tax collector pasting those stamps on documents may seem comical today, but to the colonists, it was an affront to their very freedom. In their eyes, British officials were like a foreign invader showing up and telling them how to do business. So what was the result? Well, the response to the Stamp Act was swift and decisive. Colonial merchants refused to buy British goods. They organized boycotts and protests, and then there were the Sons of Liberty. This was a secret organization of patriots who harassed stamp distributors until many resigned. When Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it seemed like a victory for the colonists. But this was kind of a hollow victory, because while the Stamp Act was repealed, Britain passed something called the Declaratory Act. This insisted that Parliament had the right to pass any law it wanted for the colonies. So despite the repeal of the Stamp Act, Britain was still asserting its authority over the colonies. Okay, so number 5 and 6, the Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre. The Townshend Acts were a series of acts passed in 1767 that placed duties on items like glass, paint, paper, and tea. Again, this was all about raising money. In response to the Townshend Acts, colonial leaders organized another round of boycotts, and this time, things got kind of messy. In 1768, British troops arrived in Boston to help enforce order, and this created an atmosphere of suspicion and animosity. Things reached a boiling point on March 5, 1770, when a crowd gathered in Boston to protest the presence of British soldiers. There's some debate over exactly what happened next, but the end result was 5 dead colonists and 1 major propaganda victory for the Patriots. Either way, the event became known as the Boston Massacre, and this helped turn public opinion against the British. Soon after, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but the tax on tea remained as a reminder of British authority. Okay, number 7, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act to help the struggling British East India Company. The law allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price, but the tax was still in effect. The colonists saw the Tea Act as a trick to get them to accept taxation, and so they organized a massive act of defiance. On December 16, 1773, a group of patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships carrying tea in the Boston harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. As you can probably imagine, Britain was outraged. They saw the Tea Party as an act of destruction and disrespect, and so they responded with the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Okay, so number 8, the Intolerable Acts. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed a series of harsh laws designed to punish the city of Boston and Massachusetts as a whole. These laws closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, gave the royal governor more power, allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, required colonists to house British troops. Instead of weakening resistance, the Intolerable Acts actually strengthened it. Okay, and that brings us to now. 9. The First Continental Congress. In September 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia to coordinate colonial response to the Intolerable Acts. At the Congress, delegates agreed to boycott British goods to form local militias in case of conflict. And they sent a petition to King George III, asking him to repeal the Intolerable Acts. Of course, the king ignored them, and instead Britain prepared to use force to keep the colonies in line. Okay, and that brings us to number 10, Lexington and Concord. In 1775, British troops stationed in Boston were ordered to seize colonial weapons stored in the nearby town of Concord, Massachusetts. On April 19th, British soldiers marched toward Concord, but colonial militias warned of their coming by Paul Revere and others. And so, when the British arrived in Concord, they were met by armed minutemen. The first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired, and soon fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord. Within a year, the Continental Army was formed, and the colonies were officially at war with Great Britain. Okay, why did this period matter? Well, between 1763 and 1775, the colonies went from being generally loyal subjects of the British Empire to open rebels. There were several reasons for this. 1. Economic pressure. Britain's debt after the French and Indian War forced it to find new sources of revenue, and it chose its colonies. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act especially angered the colonists, who had grown accustomed to a tax-free existence. 2. Political principles. Colonists believed in the principles of self-government, and they argued that, since they had no voice in Parliament, they shouldn't be taxed by it. 3. British missteps. Every time Britain attempted to tighten its grip on the colonies, resistance only intensified. 4. Shared outrage. Events like the Boston Massacre and Tea Party turned public opinion sharply against Britain. In the end, the desire for independence was too strong, and on July 4, 1776, the colonies declared themselves the United States of America. Okay, click right here to keep reviewing for Unit 3, and forget to subscribe if you want me to keep making these videos.